primary motions. You guys remember these, right? Okay. Were you guys aware of those over your break? Anybody aware of your primary motions? Or you were just resting and not paying attention to primary motions? And we talked about positions and patterns, right? So positions were like the complex attack, so withdraw, withdraw, withdraw. Those are the patterns. Then we have interpersonal positions, which is the one side, the attack, the pursuer, the withdrawer. Okay, is this coming back to you? Okay, this comes back from the attachment stuff? Okay, good. And so then we looked at a video where we tried to pick out the primary emotions. We watched Prue and Mark picking out the primary emotions that they were sharing and that Sue Johnson was interpreting. And they were looking at their present experiences. We were processing their patterns. And remember, Sue was talking about, okay, so when you were in Ottawa and you had this young baby and you felt like he whisked you away and there was no one there, and then he went off to work, and so then you went to your parents' house. She defined these broad sort of strokes of these patterns in their relationship until she's going to get down into a more specific pattern that we'll show you tonight. And then she was identifying their positions, right? So it's like you don't want to reach to him, like you want to sit there and you want to withdraw from him because this hurts so much, right? So she's identifying the positions. And so keep thinking positions, patterns, and process. For the right position, pattern, and primary motion, right? Primary motion is what drives, because emotion means to move. Primary motions drive the pattern and the positions. So if we can get the primary motions, then we can explore, then we can drive something different. Because when certain emotions, when softer emotions and primary emotions emerge, they tend to drive different patterns. When secondary emotions emerge, they drive other patterns. So like anger drives a different pattern than sadness drives. But if a couple is in a dance out here where anger is driving the pattern, then the behaviors are the same within the pattern of anger. But if the emotion is sadness, then it tends to interrupt the familiar pattern, right? But the familiar pattern is to involve the anger, which is the secondary emotional response, which is actually less vulnerable for anger to drive the pattern than it is for another emotion to drive the pattern. Right? So safety and vulnerability are really important towards healthy, secure-based patterns. And these are the patterns that they're unfamiliar with and that leave them feeling vulnerable and uncertain and susceptible to injury. So in order to get in a secure-based pattern, you have to let your sword and your shield down, and that's really scary for couples to do. Let their sword and shield down, because their sword and shield has been their anger and their defense and their criticism and their contempt and all these things that keep them safe and less vulnerable. Okay, so anytime we talk about primary emotions, we're moving them into vulnerable positions. So as you transition them out of secondary emotion and secondary emotional responses into primary emotions, then you're moving them into vulnerable positions which are conducive to secure-based sequences. Is this confusing, right? Does this make sense? Okay, secure-based sequence or pattern is being primed by a soft emotion. Because soft emotions prime caring responses in the pattern. Right? So Valerie and I are in a pattern, and I offer her sadness. It's going to elicit a attachment-based caring response, which is a different type of response than if I go with anger, attack. It's going to elicit a different response in her, right? It's going to elicit defend and withdraw, and then the withdrawal is going to create more anger in me. It's not actually anger. Anger is what I'm aware of as my secondary emotional response, and then I'm going to attack again, then we're going to stay in our cycle. But let's say I go, you know what, Valerie, I'm not really angry, I'm really sad. Then all of a sudden I disrupt the pattern. And the sadness of the emotion not only disrupts the pattern within Valerie, disrupts the pattern within me. Because if I identify with sadness, it changes my perception. If I identify with anger, it changes my perception. So the emotions cloud perceptions, right? And so if you shift the emotion, it shifts the perception and the behavior, which is really what plays out. What's observable in the pattern is the perceptions being played out in the behavior, right? And then you can also see the emotions too. So those emotions and perceptions and behaviors are part of the pattern that's getting played out. So the target of change is the emotion. If you change the emotion, you disrupt the pattern. And then we'll talk about more tonight. If you change the emotion, disrupt the pattern, then you get to the unmet attachment needs. If you don't, if the emotion is not the target of the change, then it won't ever be safe enough to get to the unmet attachment needs. Okay? And it's getting in the unmet attachment needs and identifying the unmet attachment needs and starting to meet those needs that actually gets you in the full pattern that is sustainable, right? Like in session, I can transition you into primary emotions and it can start to create a different pattern. But if those unmet attachment needs aren't acknowledged, then it's just a temporary pattern replacement. As soon as you go back home, right, you can't sustain that because the unmet attachment needs continue to go unmet, which then result in protest, which is anger. Okay, as long as there are unmet attachment needs, there will always be anger or withdrawal. So until those attachment needs are being met, there will always be a negative pattern in place that is being primed by secondary emotions. As soon as those primary attachment needs are met, then it primes other emotions that are pro-secure-based emotions, like longing, joy, peace, and these emotions drive you towards the relationship, develop an appetite for movement towards the relationship. So as long as you're in protest, right, then the secondary emotion of anger is going to emerge. And protest is a healthy emotion, right, if it's protesting unmet attachment needs, as long as you can get to those attachment needs and soften yourself to prime emotions to get those attachment needs. Okay. All right, so here we go. So I had you identify the positions, patterns, and the prime emotions. So now we're going to talk about the interventions, okay? So these are interventions to help us get to the primary emotions, right, to the patterns, and to the positions, and to interrupt them. So we'll go through the interventions, and then we'll talk about how to use the interventions in disrupting the cycle, okay? So the first intervention is the monitoring the collaborative alliance. You guys are going to know this from your open skills class, but you're just monitoring the space between you and the client. Right, so Karen and I are monitoring this space. Like, how is our alliance? Always monitoring that. So I might be asking questions like, I sense this process is difficult for you, Karen. Is there some way I can be more supportive? Right, so I'm being the attuned, sensitive attachment figure, noticing my client's experience related to the space between us. So, no therapy happens unless the alliance is in place. We know this about any type of therapy that we do. Okay, reflecting secondary emotions. So I'm going to start by reflecting Karen's secondary emotions, because that's the emotions that she's aware of, and I need to validate that emotion before I can transition into a primary emotion. Right? I don't earn the right to comment on primary emotions unless I validate the client's known experience, which is secondary emotion. So I might say, you get very angry when this happens because it feels like such a no-win situation. So I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm not going to be afraid to acknowledge secondary emotions or secondary content. Okay? So, reflecting secondary emotions, then validating, you feel so alarmed that you can't even focus. When you're that afraid, you can't even concentrate. Is that it? Okay, so I'm going to do a lot of validation. One of the greatest softening things you can do in therapy, probably the greatest skill in therapy, is validation. Knownness, right? Validation is so much about communicating knownness, right? And knownness is such important. Known and prize are key elements in who we are as human beings, the things that we crave and we desire, and validation is just a sure way of communicating. I prize you and I know you, and it creates so much safety and there's so much softening. So if you ever feel stuck in therapy, you just kick into validation, because validation will get you out of it, because there's some resistance going on that's usually based on fear or safety, and so by doing validation, you start to make things safe, right, and less scary. So you should get that tattooed on you as a therapist, right? If I don't know what else to do, validate. If I'm stuck, validate. Find something to validate, and just keep validating till you get unstuck. Okay. All right. So monitoring, reflecting secondary emotions, validating. Okay. Then we go from the secondary emotions to reflecting the primary emotions, which is a different skill. So I hear you saying that you're angry, Karen. You said like that too, Karen. But I'm wondering if you're afraid of losing her. So I'm transitioning out of the secondary anger, and I'm transitioning with the end, wondering if you are afraid. And if fear is more of a primary emotion, right? And so if I go with fear, if I say, so I hear you're saying that you're angry, but I'm wondering if you're afraid of losing her. What do you think her is going to do at this point? Stay angry? Am I disruptive? Right, it's going to soften, right? Because if you're angry, you're coming out angry, but what you really want is you don't want to lose her, you're afraid. That's going to shift the narrative for the partner, right? Oh, they're not an angry person, they're afraid of losing me. And so all of a sudden it's going to disrupt the interpersonal position. As soon as you do, it's kind of the reflecting prior emotions is part of the reframe. You guys keeping up with me here? Okay, so anything, think of anything, right? Like, it sounds like you're angry, but I'm wondering if you're really sad. Sad that he's just not there for you. I'm wondering if you're really hurt. Hurt that. Okay, you can fill in the blank. It's a transition. And your interpretation of your emotions based on your attachment, understanding of attachment, right? And the emotions tied to them attachment needs. Remember we talked about that last week, right? Like, what is fear tied to? What safety or what attachment need? Someone's afraid, what do they need?
Security?
Protection. Yes. Did you guys take this on exam, right? Yes, okay, good. Don't perjure that. Okay. So you're figuring out the emotion based upon the content of the story. So if the wife's angry at the husband because the husband never calls her before he comes home, what does the content tell you? Is it anger? It has to do with protection, right? You don't protect me by calling me and letting me know that you're going to be late, right? And so that gives you a clue, it must be fear. And so I'm going to state, so when he doesn't call you on his way home, there's a party that he's partly, if you want, there's a party that's angry, and there's also a party that feels afraid that you're not important enough for him to call you, or afraid that he's never going to call you and always going to be left vulnerable. Something like that, right? Mm-hmm.
What about just the person being controlling?
Person what being
Being controlling. Yeah, what if it's not that they're scared? They're just...
Like they're feeling controlled by another person?
No, like, okay, so if you're angry...
Okay, yeah, okay. So I would say, well, so why do people control? Because they're anxious. What's anxiety? Fear. Yeah. So sometimes you want to tell her what she needs to do because there's a party that feels afraid, right? Afraid that if you don't tell her what to do, that she'll leave you, right? Or that you'll lose her, or that she'll become strong enough where she won't need you anymore. So you can pick any behavior and you can transition into primary emotion, right, with some sort of like attachment-based content. Making sense? Afraid of losing her is related to what attachment means. That's a trick question. All of them. If you lose someone, you lose all of them. Okay? You guys are so funny, like, oh gosh, which one? So mean to me, isn't it? All right. So, but if I would say something like you're afraid of failing her, what would that be related to? What attachment? Yes, acceptance. Right. Is this all coming together? Okay, keep it together. Support. All right, evocative responding. This is a great one. So this is expanding the couple's response to include bodily responses, associations, desires, and meanings or action tendencies. So in Latin it means to call. So I'm calling something out, right? I'm asking, right? Okay, so this is what it's going to look like. What happens when you hear your wife? So I'm calling something out that's not already out. So it's like a mindful question, kind of, right? What happens when you hear your wife talking like this, John? How do you feel as you listen to her say this? This is an interpretation. This is an evocative responding. I'm evoking a response. Tell me what it's like. It's a great way to start evocative responding. Tell me what it's like. What happens inside of you? Right? So when Susie pulls away and she shakes her fist at you, what happens inside of you, John? That's an evocative response. So using the skill of evocative responding, I'm going to pull out the inner experience of the client, put it into words. What is it that you feel? What is it that you see? What is it that you perceive? What is it that you do? What is it that you want to do? This is one that you'll use a lot as far as the question, right? I'm going to evoke something that's not being offered. So John's just sitting there, right? Wife says, you know, I'm just so angry, I just leave, and and I just get in my car and I drive away. And then John just says,